Hi Matthew, thank you so much for coming in today. I wanted to talk to you about what you think the relevance of yoga philosophy is for people in the modern world.
What I try to emphasize when I facilitate discussion in yoga philosophy is that the first thing to do is to make sure that it's acutely relevant to our actual context, our social psychology, our sociopolitics, and to our individual intimate lives. So I start out with a couple of premises, and one is that it's really important to keep in mind what our general condition is. We live in a very unstable world in many ways. We live in a world that is terrifyingly threatened by climate change. We don't know what to do. We carry the stress of that in our tissues. We endlessly distract ourselves with whatever we can find. And if the philosophy and practice of yoga has anything to offer to that context, it would be a sense of both attentiveness, attunement, and I'd also say a sense of resilience. So my continual objective is to take yoga philosophy out of its kind of museum or curatorial phase and to first ask the question, what do we need? And I think we need to be profoundly aware of our actual condition, first of all. And then a little bit more complex, I think we have to be aware of how the aspirations of yoga practice can so easily be co-opted by our consumerist and I would say even neoliberal drives. The message that we're constantly getting from the dominant paradigm is you are the center of everything. Your world is a matter of perception and intention. You are theoretically limitless in your capacities. And these are all positive psychological messages in many ways, but what they tend to leave out is that there are vast structural and very embedded political realities that create a kind of structural inequality that make it difficult for any single individual to absolutely seize control over their life, which is what the constant advertising is encouraging us to do.
What's the meaning of yoga to you, Matthew?
I can give a partial answer, and I hope it's useful. It's very important to say that yoga arises from the wellspring of passion and wisdom that is India, but from many places within India over many hundreds of years, if not thousands. And it is now a global, syncretic, hybridized set of techniques for breaking patterns, breaking behavioral patterns, breaking inefficient patterns of movement, inefficient patterns of breathing, inefficient patterns of communicating, inefficient patterns of organizing our internal psychology. Often the Patanjali Yoga Shastra is quoted as being kind of the central text of the modern postural yoga movement, and the entire focus of Patanjali's work is to first describe and then discuss the means by which the patterns that we live by, especially those patterns that are recurrent, entrenched, unconscious, how they might be alleviated by turning our attention towards something that's a little bit more stable inside of us. So I think what's very important for me always is to consider yoga as a tradition, but as a tradition with many, many streams and very few boundaries, and as a tradition that in a way resists tradition whenever it pops up. If we think about tradition as being a set way of doing things in our lives, a way that we have conditioned ourselves to either move or breathe or think or discuss, yoga always seems to come along to disrupt patterns at various points in history. And I think on the simplest level, for the day-to-day practitioner, it might be the matter of, the patterning of forward head carriage or, internal rotation of the humerus bones. It might be a lack of stability in the hip joints. It might be the effects of an overly sedentary life and all of the internal tensions that build up with that. And then all the way up to the most complex level, I think that yoga offers a way of thinking about things that is like absolutely dedicated to discovering where we're simply spinning our wheels, where we are having recurrent thoughts, recurrent self-ideas, recurrent self-perceptions, things that trap us into boxes. So I think that might be the simplest answer, is that yoga is whatever breaks open the box. And that box can be the box of your social identity. It can be the box of how you feel your body to be objectified. I don't think it's any mistake that 80% of the world's yoga practitioners are women. And the box might be a set of beliefs that you either have about how the world works or should work or how you should be, especially beliefs about how you should be, I think, because it's very easy for beliefs about how you should be to actually be internalizations of some kind of external power. And I think yoga always pushes back against that. If there's some kind of external power that is rolling the shoulders forward and drawing our attention towards digital media 24/7, yoga resists that. If there's a kind of power mentally that leads us towards categorical thinking, yoga resists that and says, there's always another view. If there's a way in which, we are in a box of psychological repetition, yoga always offers this opportunity to understand the ephemeral nature of the emotions. So, whatever gets out of the box.
What is your view on the different schools of yoga? Do you think it's a one size fits all?
No. In fact, I think one of the things that modern yoga really has to become aware of and clean up its act around is the fact that it has globalized through the same system of commercial branding that we see in the corporate world, in which a system or a technique or a collection of postures or movements is codified, branded, packaged, commodified, and if yoga is about disrupting patterns, then we have to really ask ourselves whether or not the thing that's packaged, the thing that is framed in terms of, this is exactly what we're going to do, this is our lineage, then I think we have to look carefully at that. So is there one yoga for everybody? No. In fact, I think the notion that there is one yoga for everything also, or for everybody, also is the product of a lot of hubris. I think of John Friend, for example, who, because of a set of personal revelations with regard to how posture seemed to work for him, comes up with 5 universal principles of alignment, which he then travels around the world for 10 years and claims will cure anybody of anything, basically, will help any human being find their optimal blueprint. This is what this is like the evangelization of a private experience. Somebody saying, this thing worked for me and so it must work for you. And when we get into that, we're not really talking about yoga, we're talking about marketing. We're talking about trying to sell something. And that's why I always say, you know, if you're really practicing and teaching yoga, it'd be very difficult to make money, actually, because there's nothing to package. There's just a series of movement techniques, mindfulness techniques, breathing techniques that have to be applied individually according to circumstance, and you can't really bottle that.
So how is a person to choose what to do?
I would say that a person I would say something that a traditionalist would be horrified at, which is that a person should shop around. Many people will say, in fact, in the Ashtanga system, they say, you know, if you dig many different holes, you'll never hit water. But if you dig at the same hole over and over and over again, or deeply enough, you will find water. And, you know, if we live in a parched landscape, we want to hit water. But at the same time, I think it's very important to understand that each particular stream of postural yoga that's on offer in the global marketplace has its own benefits and its limitations. People are having wonderful experiences in all of them, and people are getting hurt in all of them as well. You know, there are many reasons for why people get hurt in asana, but I think whenever you have a closely defined movement vocabulary that doesn't really do a lot of exploring or a lot of cross-training, it's going to come up against limitations. And so I would advise the student to just ask themselves, if they're doing something repetitive, if they're doing something that seems to be similar every day, does that give them a sense of groundedness? And if so, that's great. But on top of that groundedness, does it perhaps allow them to simply repeat patterns, or perhaps even play into movement patterns or breathing patterns or even aspirational patterns that that somehow capitalize on their weak spots? Are they being challenged continually? Are they always learning? I think this is a key thing. I would ask the student to be really clear on whether or not they're learning something every time they come to the mat. Because I think it's very easy for us to hit a kind of plateau in practice where, you know, we've learned the movements, we've learned the breath work, we've learned the language, we've learned the attitude we're meant to adopt when we come into the room. We've learned all of those things, and there's a kind of plateau, there's a leveling off of passion. And if a person feels that, I would encourage them to continue looking, to add something else, to continue to learn.
Can you tell me a bit more about your current project that you're working on?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mouthful. The project's called What Are We Actually Doing in Asana? And it arises out of the fact that in Toronto, where I'm from, Canada, I was a yoga community organizer, and that put me in touch with many, many teachers, probably the majority of yoga teachers in the city, all of the studio owners. I spent 6 years as an Ayurvedic therapist in downtown Toronto, mainly serving the yoga community, and also over a decade of practice, speaking to students and colleagues. It became clear to me that, you know, almost nobody gets out of yoga without an injury. Now, that's not a big deal in one regard. People are injuring themselves doing all kinds of things. But what's distinct, and perhaps concerning about yoga injuries is that people are usually drawn to yoga for implied therapeutic benefits. And people, they'll sign studio waivers acknowledging that they might get injured in class and that their teachers are not, medical authorities or anything like that. But there's this overall principle within the marketing that this is good for you. And after, as I said, about a decade of hearing stories of difficulty, and some stories were about people pushing themselves too far. Some stories were about people coming into practice with prior conditioning issues that gave them some disadvantage. But then there were other stories of people being aggressively or invasively adjusted by teachers, and those were actually most troubling. So there's a whole range of injuries that I had heard about, and as I slowly drew down my professional teaching career, because I started to write and to travel more, I had the time and the distance away from the industry enough to be able to look at it without any kind of, or with a declining professional stake, which allowed me to be a little bit more honest about what I'd heard. And when I decided to formally research, I suppose, the shadow side of this wonderful art form, I put out a call on social media, and I got hundreds upon hundreds of responses, people wanting to tell me stories about how they had injured themselves, how they'd been injured, incompetent teaching, poor biomechanics advice, being adjusted in ways that weren't appropriate or that were too forceful. And so I immediately found myself up to my neck in, I think, a lot of untold stories so far. And it's been about 1.5 years that I've been working on it. I've done almost, I would say, about 150 interviews. And it's not just interviews of practitioners and teachers, but also interviews of yoga scholars, biomechanics researchers, exercise scientists, people who work in the neuroscience of movement, to try to figure out what exactly is happening when people come to the mat. What are they doing in their movement practices? What kind of psychology do they bring to practice? What are the social pressures in the room that contribute to the experience in one way or another? So it's a very wide-ranging study, and I'm intensely grateful to my very patient interview subjects who have shared so much with me. And not only have they shared, this is what I love about the project, not only have they shared stories of trial and tribulation, but every shadow is instrumental to some form of learning that they usually describe for me. One of the first interviews that I did was with Victor Van Kooten, and I think I'm going to begin the book with this interview. He was with Mr. Iyengar for 15 years. Studied with him in Pune for much of that time, went back and forth between India and Europe. And at a certain point in their relationship, he describes there being some interpersonal tension, a little bit of distance emerging in this teacher-student relationship, which is very strong. And in that context, one day, Mr. Iyengar adjusts Victor over a 4x4 inch post, and as he does so, he injures Victor's back. Now, it's not diagnosed, there's no X-ray or MRI from the time, but Victor is so injured that he's immobilized for many, many days, cannot move. And this sort of is the beginning part of the disintegration of the relationship, unfortunately. But it's also the starting point for Victor reimagining how asana is for him or should be for him. So as he's lying paralyzed in his bed in Pune, he's a visual artist and by trade, and he says to himself, well, how will I move my legs again? And he begins a process of visualizing space around his legs, and he finds that if he can visualize this space strongly enough, distinctly enough, that somehow it motivates the musculature, the bones, the leg itself to flow into this new space. So instead of doing what he had done for the past 15 years, which was to obey the alignment instructions of this very certain, very stern teacher, he then began to imagine the new space that his body could flow into. And it's on the basis of that that his entire teaching practice began to emerge, his unique teaching practice began to emerge. So every story is like that. Every story of overwork yields to a kind of story of acceptance. Every story of interpersonal strife yields, if not to forgiveness, to a deeper sense of interpersonal wisdom. And so I've been really grateful for that. I think that the title of the project, What Are We Actually Doing in Asana, ironically is impossible to answer, as the research is showing me. But the stories that I get to hear as I ask the question are so rich that I hope they will be of benefit to people who are navigating some unconscious stuff when they come to the mat, unconscious motivations, especially.